Today, we begin our exploration of the history of the PRC with the period from 1949 to the early 1960s, just after the Great Leap Forward and just before the Cultural Revolution. We will be focusing on the CCP's efforts to build a new China through mass campaigns and collectivization. These enabled the party to penetrate all aspects of social and cultural life, redistribute power and resources, and indoctrinate and mobilize persons to remake the country violently if necessary. These early years of the PRC can be further subdivided as follows. The period 1949 to 52 is typically referred to as New Democracy. In this period, the party was willing to make compromises with certain bourgeois elements, especially in cities, but embarked on an ambitious program of land reform in the countryside. The years from 1953 to 57 were the years of the first five-year plan, during which the party accelerated the transition to socialism in industry and agriculture. Finally, we have the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 62, a great disaster and tragedy born of Mao's faith in the power of the masses to realize communism through sheer force of will. We will also be exploring the PRC in the world in this period because the domestic transformation of the PRC and its foreign relations were inseparable from each other. We will focus in particular on the Sino-Soviet relationship, which comes apart by the end of the 1950s. We will also look at how the PRC navigated the international politics of the Cold War and decolonization, such as with regards to Korea and the Third World. So, land reform was at the heart of the communist revolution because most of China's population was rural. In the party's view, the old agricultural system that had been around for millennia was the problem because it was dominated by an exploitative class of persons who owned land and exploited the tenant farmers who worked on it, such as by charging them high rents or heavy taxes. The party had already begun implementing land reform during the Yan'an period and was now in a position to extend it to the rest of China with the passing of the 1950 Agrarian Reform Law. That's the image on this slide. But this was tricky. Mobilizing peasants was hard. It required party members to gain access to villages, which was difficult if you had no connections to persons from those villages. You had to be careful to classify people, villagers, properly. In reality, rather than landlords and tenants, local society consisted of a much finer web of social relations. You could be a poor, middling, or rich peasant, for example. If you both owned some land and worked on other person's land, what would become of you? And what if you were not a landlord, but just so happened to be someone whom all your neighbors hated for other reasons? Another problem was the size and diversity of the country. Landlordism was less of a problem in the north, where tenancy was not big a problem. But in the south, tenancy, which is working on someone else's land, was more widespread, and land was often not owned by individual landlords, but large lineages. In such areas, it was typical for tenants to rent land from landlords within their own lineage, in other words, from their own kinsmen, which made it harder to mobilize them and instill in them the appropriate class consciousness. All this notwithstanding, land reform proceeded apace with the stated goal of eliminating landlords as a class. Party cadres went deep into the countryside, rousing villagers to attach class labels to each other and then denounce landlords in mass struggle meetings. Land was then taken from the land rich and given to the landless. If you were classified as bourgeois or capitalist, you could actually be redeemed if you admitted your crimes and asked for forgiveness. But in many cases, eliminating landlords meant just killing them. Possibly up to a few million people died this way. We don't have the exact figures. By the summer of 1952, almost 43% of China's arable land had been redistributed to about 60% of the population. Hence, posters like these celebrating the accomplishments of land reform. A second crucial piece of legislation put into place during this early period was the 1950 marriage law, written with input from female party leaders. Like land reform, this was not a new policy. They were historical antecedents. It came directly out of the CCP's earlier efforts at promoting gender inequality, in Jiangxi and Yan'an. And some of the provisions of this marriage law resembled the KMT's Civil Code of 1930. This law struck at the very heart of the traditional family and was the culmination of efforts to change this system going all the way back to the May 4th movement. The law abolished the traditional family system, quote, based on arbitrary and compulsory arrangements and the superiority of man over woman, unquote. It was based on, quote, equal rights for both sexes and on the protection of the lawful interests of women and children, unquote. So arranged marriages, child betrothals, polygamy, the selling of women into marriage, and infanticide were all forbidden. Women could also now initiate divorce proceedings, not just men. And single women, divorcees, and widows could own land in their own names, not their husbands' names. Again, though, this proved complicated to implement in reality and intensified social friction. Now, that intensification of social friction isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's oftentimes a good thing in Maoism. So, party cadres, who were usually men, had to contend with angry villagers if they went through with implementing the marriage law. And this might affect these cadres' efforts to promote land reform, meaning that the marriage law was oftentimes not enforced, right? How do you balance between promoting the marriage law and promoting land reform at the same time? Millions of women sought divorces, and this angered not only their husbands who stood to lose their wives, but also, crucially, their mothers-in-law. And so, unsurprisingly, violence ensued. From 1950 to 1953, the Ministry of Justice reported that 70 to 80,000 people, most of them women, killed themselves or were killed by family members because of family conflicts. Okay, let's turn now to cities. The party under Mao had come to power by mobilizing the rural masses, which constituted most of the population. But after 1949, it had to govern cities as well, and cities faced their own set of problems: inflation, unemployment, opium trafficking and smuggling, and prostitution, for example. The party had to deal with students, intellectuals, sex workers, beggars, and businessmen. And all these persons had to be reformed through different means. So let us consider how the party managed two categories of urban dwellers. The first are female sex workers. For party cadres, cities, large numbers of madams and prostitutes were indicative of corrupt urban morals and the exploitation of poor women. To remedy this moral and political deficit in Shanghai, the party rounded up prostitutes and brothel owners, and the latter got sent to prison or to labor reform. As for the prostitutes themselves, they got sent to something called the Women's Training Institute, or the Women's Labor Training Institute. Here, they were provided with medical cares for sexually transmitted diseases. They were provided with job retraining and ideological remolding to transform them into model socialist women. And they were then released after a couple years. And so in a relatively short amount of time, Shanghai's burgeoning sex industry was rendered invisible. Let's also, think about Chinese businessmen and industrialists. There is a reason why I have an image of one of Singapore's finest schools with its founder statue in front on this slide. Now, what is interesting is that most businessmen and industrial elites had not fled China in 1949, even though they could. Many, in fact, even chose to return from abroad in the early 1950s. One of these persons was Tan Ka-ki, the founder of Chinese High School, or Hua Chong Institution as it is known today. Some of you may be alumni of this distinguished institution. Now, the party's initial attitude towards these overseas Chinese returnees, these businessmen, was relatively pragmatic. Mao distinguished between what he called national capitalists, 民主资本家, whom he considered patriots, and comprador bureaucratic capitalists, 买办官僚资本家. And these were bad capitalists, These were persons who were in league with foreign imperialists and corrupt officials. And the party was willing to work with only the first group, national capitalists. And so accordingly, before 1951-2, the party did not seek to expropriate their property immediately. Instead, it invited them to sell their property to the state an annually increasing percentage of their industries and to stay on as managers and trainers. In 1951 and 52, however, the party's approach to cities became more radical with the 3 and 5 Antis campaigns. The first campaign, the 3 Antis campaign, targeted corruption, waste, and bureaucracy. And the second, the 5 Antis campaign, targeted bribery, tax evasion, theft of state assets, cheating on labor or materials, and stealing state economic intelligence. With these campaigns, then the party signaled that it was taking a hard line against not just party cadres and state bureaucrats, but also against the national bourgeoisie whom it had previously accommodated. These 2 campaigns enriched the state's coffers through fines and heavy taxes. So land reform destroyed traditional rural relationships between landowners and tenants in the same way that these campaigns upended relationships between employers and employees in cities. Again, as with peasants, urban employees were encouraged to denounce their superiors, as can be seen from this image on the left from your textbook. Okay, all these campaigns in the early 1950s, from land reform to marriage reform to the 3 and 5 Antis campaigns, took place against the backdrop of profound changes in international politics. For Mao, transforming China into a powerful, modern socialist country was inseparable from elevating its status within the international system. And we must remember here that this was a system from which the PRC was officially excluded by virtue of not being a member of the United Nations until 1971. Now, just like at home, Mao was not averse to the use of force in foreign relations, but his ultimate goal, according to the historian Chien-Wen, was enhancing China's prestige, reputation, and influence in the world. It was not territorial or economic expansion. Now, we can quibble with him. We can disagree with Chien-Wen here. The PRC invaded Tibet in October 1950. Mao claimed as had Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, that Tibet, a former Qing protectorate, was part of the Chinese nation, and thus its status was not a question of foreign relations, but sort of internal issues. That said, in 1949, Tibet had been a de facto independent state for 40 years, which is why I am including Tibet in this discussion of China's foreign relations. Now, if centrality was Mao's principal goal, then he succeeded. The PRC became an important Cold War actor. It contributed over the slightly longer term to the downfall of the USSR. It inspired radical movements globally, especially in Southeast Asia, such as the Malayan Communist Party. And because of this, the PRC became a source of great anxiety among non-communist countries, such as the United States. For a time, the US feared coordination between China and national liberation movements like the MCP. And indeed, the Cold War in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, was grounded in such fears of Chinese communist expansion in partnership with overseas Chinese communities. And these fears were largely more imagined than real. In February 1950, the PRC and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance. And this marked the beginning of a decade-long close partnership between the two largest communist countries in the world. Now, Mao's relationship with Stalin was, as they say today, complicated. Why? The Soviet Union, we know, had been far from a reliable ally of the CCP. This went back all the way to Stalin's continued support for the First United Front in 1927, even after the White Terror had begun. This 1950 treaty was not the first such treaty between China and the USSR. An earlier treaty had been signed in 1945 between Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek. And this earlier treaty provided for, among other things, the formal independence of Outer Mongolia as a Soviet satellite. So Mongolia became an independent state, but a state that the Soviets very much held sway over. Stalin, in return for Mongolia, agreed to respect Chiang's position as the leader of China's legal government. This was in 1945. This was just before the Civil War broke out. So Stalin was hardly a trustworthy ally, even if he had secretly provided arms to the CCP during the Civil War. But with the CCP lacking allies and facing an immense task of reconstructing China after a decade of war, Mao decided to, in his words, lean to one side. He perceived the US as a greater threat. And this is why in December 1949, Mao visited Moscow. He traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin, which was his very first trip abroad. Mao was not a cosmopolitan, even if his ideology, right, even if Mao Zedong thought, even if Maoism became influential globally. Crucially, Stalin treated Mao with condescension, and this is something that Mao would never forget. So the PRC became part of the emerging communist world. The Sino-Soviet relationship was an unequal one, and it would ultimately collapse, but it was significant for the PRC domestically during the mid-1950s because of all the Soviet economic, military, and technical aid that poured into China, enabling the CCP to push forward with its first five-year plan. The Sino-Soviet relationship was also crucial during the Korean War that broke out less than a year after the PRC was founded. In brief, in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea after North Korean leader Kim Il-sung had gotten Stalin's permission to do so. In response, US-led United Nations peacekeeping forces mounted a counter-offensive beginning in the south and pushed northwards towards the border between China and Korea. Now, even before China became involved in the Korean War, the outbreak of this conflict had significant consequences for China. Mao had been making plans to invade Taiwan, which the KMT had fled to. But Mao could not invade Taiwan when the US dispatched its 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait following North Korea's invasion. And so this dispatching of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait also prevented Chiang Kai-shek from launching his own counterattack against the so-called communist bandit regime, or 共匪政权, on the mainland. The PRC launched artillery bombardments of the Republic of China-controlled island chains of Quemoy, right, Chien-Wen and Mazu in 1954 to 55 and 1958, but it could never attack the island of Taiwan itself. And if you are interested in how the Communist Party perceived Taiwan, this article by Frank Xiao and Lawrence Sullivan argues that between 1928 and 1943, the Chinese Communist Party actually recognized Taiwan as a distinct nation, recognized the Taiwanese as a distinct nation or nationality. And they acknowledged the national liberation movement on Taiwan, right, against Japanese imperialism, as a struggle of a weak and small nationality, which was separate from the Chinese Revolution. So it's only really after 1943 and the Cairo Conference that year that the CCP reversed its position by rejecting Taiwanese ethnic separateness and Taiwanese independence. And that is the position, obviously, that it holds today. Okay, it is the PRC's intervention in the Korean War that I want to focus on here. Mao had earlier committed the PRC to North Korea for both ideological and security reasons. Now, one war had just ended. The United States had nukes, but Mao nonetheless decided to mobilize against the United States, not by sending in the People's Liberation Army, but through a People's Volunteer Army, right? 人民志愿军, which was led by his closest military advisor, Peng Dehuai, whom we will talk about later as well. The PVA was backed by Soviet air support, but otherwise was on its own. The PVA forces were outmatched in terms of equipment, but had a numerical advantage and were able to push US forces back down south, bringing about the stalemate between North and South Korea that lasts until today. You get a sense of how the PVA's campaign was perceived in China, right? And the demonstrations in support of the resisting America and assisting Korea that took place in China at the time. Now, the PVA, we estimate, or historians estimate, suffered about 400,000 to 900,000 losses. One of Mao's own sons, in fact, perished in the Korean War. And we estimate the cost of mobilization for the PRC to have come up to around US 2.5 billion. This is compared to 20 billion for the United States during the Korean conflict. So, for Mao, despite these losses, the war was a political victory. The world watched as the PRC went toe-to-toe with a nuclear superpower. The war cemented Mao's leadership and was highly effective for domestic mobilization under the banner of resisting America and assisting Korea, 抗美援朝. Now, in addition to land reform, which we've talked about, and the 3 and 5 antis campaigns, which we've talked about, a campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, right, 镇压反革命运动, from 1950 to 1953 was launched during the Korean War to weed out remaining KMT agents in China. That's what this poster is all about. Now, again, we don't know how many persons perished during this campaign, but probably more than 2 million.